Hi there, so welcome to this segment of the training where we begin to learn how to construct our 5 basic blocks. So by now I expect that you already have your measurements that you want to use, because I have mine here and I'm going to be using my measurements here. My shoulder is 16, my length of back is 16 or back half length. I measure 16 and a half, but I always like to use 16. I'm going to be using 16 for my length of back. Then my bust is 40, my waist is 34, my hip is 44, then my bust point is 11, my under bust point is 15 and a half, my shoulder to waist, that's my front half length. Remember, there is back half length and there is front half length. Okay, my front half length is 20, and then I have my bicep, I have my bust span, my nipple to nipple is 8 inches, bicep is 14 inches, and then my skirt length, that is, my skirt length will be from my natural waistline to my knee, from my natural waistline to my ankle and to the floor. And then of course my sleeve length, that's from this point to this point, from here to here, from here to here, and from here to here. So I expect that you also have your measurements or the measurements of your model. So but before we begin construction, I have some things here I'd like to show you. But before we begin construction, I'd like to talk about measurements and how we apply them in construction. Now you have your measurements, but you do not apply those measurements as they are. There's some division you need to do. Now there are different categories of measurements. There are measurements you divide into 4, there are measurements you divide into 2, and there are measurements you use as is. Now the first category would be measurements you divide into 4. That would be measurements taken around the entire body. Now, how do I mean? Meaning that the measurements you took around the body, for example, the bust circumference, the waist circumference, the hip circumference, those ones are taken around the entire body, front and back. When you want to apply those measurements in construction, you have to divide them into 4. For example, my hip measurement is 44. So when I divide that into 4, I get 11. So when I want to apply it in construction, I use 11. So I hope that is clear. So now the measurements for the ones that are divided into 4 are the bust, the waist, and the hip. When you want to apply them in construction, you divide into 4. Now the next set of measurements is the one that you divide into 2. Now basically there are actually three of them, not 2. I wanted to say 2, but there are 3. The first one is the shoulder measurements. That is because it's taken from left to right. Any measurements taken from left to right or right to left, you divide it into 2. Anyone taken round the body, you divide into 4. So one of the first measurements that we took from one side to one side is the shoulder. Remember, we took the shoulder from here to here. The next measurement is the bust span, nipple to nipple, from here to here. So the distance between the bust span. Now that is from left to right or right to left. So that you divide into 2. For example, my shoulder is 16. When I want to apply it to measurement, I use 8. My bust span is 8. When I want to apply it to measurement, I use 4. So the final one is also your armhole, your bicep and your thigh. That's any part of the measurement that has to do with the limb. When you want to apply in construction, you divide into 2. For example, if my bicep is 14, my bicep is 14. If I want to apply it in construction, I use 7. Although I use as is and I also divide into 2, but when we are doing the construction, you understand what I mean by dividing into 2 and use as is. Finally, the final category of measurements is the one that you use as is. So what do I mean by use as is? Meaning that you have to use what you measured. All measurements that have to do with length, all lengthwise measurements you use as is. What do I mean? Length of back, length of front, skirt length, that's waist to floor, waist to knee, sleeve length. Any measurement that is lengthwise, you use as is. There's no need to divide. So, given that, we can begin construction. So I just thought to explain that first before we begin learning the construction. So right here, I have my 5 basic blocks. This is why we call them blocks. I haven't constructed them because they are blocks. It's just a simple plain rectangle. This is going to be for my back bodies. This is the block for my front bodies. This is the block for my skirt back. This is the block for my skirt front. And finally, this is the block for my sleeves. So you can see that they are all plain sheets. They're just plain rectangles. So we're going to do the construction in each rectangle, and I'm going to tell you the size of each rectangle, how I came about each one, and how you should use your own measurement to come about your own block. So let's start with the back bodies. That's like the most difficult part of it. So, and once you are able to understand how to construct the back bodies, the rest is just a piece of cake. So now I have a rectangle here, and what I have here, the size of this rectangle, this size is the quarter of my bust measurement, 10 inches. So let me bring this closer for you to see. You can see that I drew like a border line. So I'm using the inner rectangle. I'm not considering the measurements from outside here. I'm considering the measurements from where you have this line and this line. So the width now is 10 inches. How did I come about 10 inches? Now 10 inches is my bust measurements divided by 4. So that's 40 divided by 4 is going to give me 10. So that's how I came about the width of this. Now, what is the length of this? The length of this is 17 inches. How did I come about 17 inches? My length of back is 16. But aside from the 16, the length of back is not measured from the side neck point. It's measured from the bone at the back. So there is a 1 inch gap between where the measurement begins and where construction begins. So I had to add 1 inch to that length to make all this to be 17. So that's how I came about 17. So at the end of the day, this block is 10 by 17. So now for someone else, it may be 8 or 8.5 by 17, depending on your chest measurements and depending on your length of back. So this is length of back plus 1 inch, that's the length, and the bust measurements divided by 4. So I hope that is clear. So now let us begin constructing the back bodies. All right, so we're about to begin constructing the back bodies. So I just want you to pay very close attention because you really need to understand this process. So I'm going to begin my construction with a pencil, and then I'm going to trace it out with a marker afterwards. So the first thing for me to do is to measure 1 inch. So I'm going to label this point here, point P. This is point P. That's the intersection between these two lines as point P. And I'm going to call this line, the first line, this is my border, I'm going to call it line A, line A1. So this first line is line A1. So I would measure 1 inch from line A1. That's the first step. To measure 1 inch from line A1 and draw a line. After you do that, you'd measure your length of back. Well, what is left is supposed to be your length of back. What I have remaining here is 16 inches. So this is line A1, and then I'll tag this line A2. So now I have two lines, line A1 and line A2 and point P. So now we begin construction. So from point P, you measure, you use the shoulder measurements. Line A1 and A2 represents the shoulder line, but it's more of line A2. But line A1 is also the shoulder. So this is where we're going to apply the shoulder measurements from point P. So we'll measure it in this direction, the half measurement of the shoulder. I'm using shoulder 16, so half of 16 will be 8 inches. So I'm going to measure 8 inches from point P all the way to this point, and I will mark. So this is 8 inches. I'm going to mark this point. I'll also measure 8 inches and mark this point. So I would just rule. I would rule that section downwards just like that. So the next thing for me to do is to take another measurement. But before I go ahead, I need to divide this line in half. So this line is the back half length, which is 16. Because I don't want to confuse you in the construction, because I need to actually create another line here before I go ahead with the construction. So I'm going to divide this line in half. So this is 16. 16 divided by 2 is 8 inches. So from line A2, I'm going to measure 8 inches. I'm going to measure 8 inches. And once I measure 8 inches, I'm going to draw another line. So that's like just half of the back half length. So at the end of the day, I have my shoulder line I have my bust line and I have my waistline. So line A1 and A2 is the shoulder line, and then I'll call this second line line B, and then I'll call the third line line C. So this is line A, line B, and line C, where line A1 and A2 is the shoulder line, line B is the bust line, and line C is the waistline. That is here. So then we can continue. Let's go back to the shoulder. So now I measured from point P to this point. I measured 8 inches. I measured on A1 and A2. So the next thing for me to do now is to apply a measurement called across back. While teaching you how to take measurements, I didn't mention across back. That's because I plan to do the calculation. Now when I want to use my across back, all I need to do is to subtract half an inch from the shoulder measurement. So instead of measuring 8 inches, I'm going to measure 7.5. So that would be from point P, I would measure 7.5. Now 7.5 we measured on line A1, line A2, and line B. I'm going to measure 7.5 on line B, line A1, line A2, and line B, and I'm going to connect the 3 points with a line. So now this line represents the across back. So it's just half of the shoulder measurements minus half. Half of the shoulder measurement is 8, subtracted by half, 7.5. So now remember when we were drawing this rectangle, we said the width of this rectangle is the bust measurement. So from this point to this point is already 10 inches. So that is my bust measurement. So the next thing I need to derive now is my waist measurement. Now remember we said line C. This is line C and this is our waistline. And it is on top, on the waistline, we actually apply the waist measurement. So we will begin measuring from here. So given that this line is the center back, we will begin the measurements from this line. My waist measurement is 34. When I divide that by 4, that will give me 8.5. 8.5. Well then, and I need another extra inch for my darts. So instead of measuring 8.5, I'll measure 9.5. So at the end of the day, I have a mark here. So now, because this is already my chest measurement, the width of this rectangle is already my bust measurement. So I will connect this point here to this point that I just marked on the waist area. So that is already connected. So we come straight to the neck area, and then we try to get the neckline. So how do I go about getting the neckline? I begin from point P and I measure 3 inches this way. So I take my measuring tape, I measure 3 inches and I mark. So remember when we started, we measured 1 inch from here to here. So the distance between these two lines here are 1 inch, is 1 inch rather. So this is point P. So I'll call this P1, then I'll call this P2. So this is an intersection here, but there's another intersection here. So from point P2, I'm going to connect this point to this point. So now at this point, you will need one of your curves to connect the points. So which of these curves are you going to use? Okay, let's check it out. All right, this is an ideal curve for you to connect your neckline. So you're going to use this part of the curve to connect your neckline. So you can see the curve. Let me just show you the curve. Okay, this is the one I selected. Then use this to draw your neckline. If you don't have this particular curve, you can use any other curve that creates this curve and connects these two perfectly. So you can see how it's nicely connected, this point to this point. So once we have done that, the next thing we need to do is to connect this to this. Now we want to create the shoulder slope. So what you need to do is from line A2, you're going to measure 1 inch along this line, you know, because while I was making the shoulder measurement, I dropped it a bit because I knew I was still going to come and use this thing here. So now from line A2, I measured 1 inch downwards. So once I've done that, I'm going to connect this point to this point with my ruler. So I'll connect that. So it's gradually coming together. So the next thing I need to do is to create my armhole. I need to connect this area together. So what I'll do then is from line A2, not from line A1 now, from line A2, I'll measure 5.5 on the line of my across back. Remember, we created a line at the beginning. So it is on this line of the across back we measure the 5.5. 5.5 is just a standard measurement. But for some other people that have longer backs, longer length of spine, you may use something longer. But for most people, their length of spine is like 15, 15.5, 16, 16.5. So 5.5 is just ideal and standard. So you're going to mark 5.5 along that point. So this is my 5.5. For me to get my armhole, I need to connect my chest measurement, that's here, to the armhole that I just marked, to the edge of the shoulder slope to give me my curve. So I'm going to use one of the curve sets to connect my armhole. I want to remove this so that it doesn't cause any. Okay, so this is the one I'm going to use to create my armhole. Like I showed you earlier, there's an armhole curve that does the same work, but this is also good. So I'm just going to connect my armhole with this curve. So you see how it connects nicely. So this connects to this. So once it touches that line, you can stop, and then this connects to this nicely. Yeah, so right there I have my armhole. So it looks already like our back bodice is set. But one last thing before we continue, we need to come to the waistline. That is here. This is the waistline, and we need to set the position of the dart. So we're going to create a perpendicular bisection. What do I mean by that? I'm going to divide this line into 2 equal halves. Remember, right here I already have 9.5. It's supposed to be 8.5, but because I added 1 inch dart, is 9.5. So if I divide 9.5 by 2, what am I going to get? Let me just quickly do that. Okay, when I divide 9.5 by 2, I'm going to get 4 3/4. So it's very important you get your arithmetic right. So this is 4 3/4. So I'm going to mark that point, and then I'm also going to come and mark 4 3/4 here. So what I want to do now is to draw a line across this area. So this is a perpendicular bisection. So I have successfully divided this portion into 2 equal halves. So after doing that, I am going to extract the darts, the 1 inch dart I added. So I'm going to mark 1/2 inch on the left, 1/2 inch on the right. So 1/2 inch on the left, 1/2 inch on the right will give me 1 inch at the end of the day. So but then I need to connect this thing to a point. What is the height of the dart? The height of the dart here is 6 inches. So from here now, I'm going to measure 6 inches upwards in this direction. So I'll measure 6 inches this way, and I mark. So now I'm going to connect this point to this point and this point to this point. So let me just do that. So I'll connect this to this, and I'll connect this to this. So finally we have our back bodies. So the last thing we need to do is just to trace out with our marker so that we cut on the right line. But if you don't have a black marker, it's fine. You can just cut already. You can just cut the part you've drawn out with your pencil. So but let me just mark this out so it's really clear and defined. So I'm going to use this. So trace out that area. Then of course I'm going to use this to trace out this area. All right, so you see that's nicely done. So I'm just following what I've done before. I'm just really trying to, I'm just trying to define and redefine that space. Then the next thing, you need to define your dots. You can do that with dotted lines because they are going to be stitched. So just to indicate that this is going to be a stitch. So you can do that with dotted lines. All right, so finally the back bodice is done. So let me just write back bodice. Okay, so I'm just going to cut it out so that we see how it looks finally. So I'm going to cut this away. Cut this out. So you see why we call it a block. I started out with a rectangle and I carved out this shape from a block. So this is the first block. So we know the dimensions of this block, how we got the length of the block and the width of the block. So this is the first block that we have done. So nicely cut out. And this is the back bodice. And that's basically how to construct your back bodice. So this is the final product of the back bodice. So after following the process quite well, this is the final result that we got from the construction that we just did for the back bodice. So now you can see this width is 10 inches. So if I use that twice, it's going to give me 20 inches for the full back. So this is the neck, this is the shoulder slope, and then this is the chest, and this is the waist, and then this is the dart. So now the next one we need to construct is the front bodice.